The 93rd Academy Award was concluded on the 25th of April, 2021. This year's Oscar was different from its predecessors for two things. For one, it was held in April instead of February, at both Union Station and the Dolby Theatre due to the pandemic. For another, more Asians could be seen in the award show, either as nominees or as winners in various categories like Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best International Feature Film, and Best Documentary Short Subject. Although Parasite won Best Picture last year and caused a little bit of fuss,
and the winner is a movie from South Korea. What the hell was that all about?
It was nothing compared to the surge in films made by or about Asian this year. This can perhaps be attributed to the worldwide pandemic of COVID-19, which was first identified in December 2019 in Wuhan, China. The virus went on to hit the United States in early 2020, leading to a dispute over its origin between China and the US. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian claimed that the virus was brought to Wuhan by the US military, while US President of the time Donald Trump repeatedly called it
the Chinese virus, Kung Flu.
As a result, violence targeted against Asian Americans saw an increase. Along with the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many more, the outcry for racial equality and the end to white supremacy have reached a level that was previously unseen. By now, it is universally known that the Oscars tend to reward films which deal with marginalized people, such as African Americans, women, and the LGBTQ community. While it is applaudable that films about marginalized people are getting recognized by Hollywood, the phenomenon is also problematic. This video essay focuses on recent Oscar-nominated pictures about African Americans and Asians, and argues that their protagonists have to conform to certain stereotypes in order to win. For African American protagonists, they have to be the victims or subjects of persecution. For Asian protagonists, they are the model minority and the yellow pearl. Green Book, Moonlight, and 12 Years a Slave were all Best Picture winners in their respective years. Apart from that, these films share one common thing: a storyline about an African American who suffers racial or sexual discriminations of some kind. According to McKee, the understanding of how we create the audience's emotional experience begins with the realization that there are only two emotions: pleasure and pain. In the case of recent African American Best Picture, it seems like there is only pain. Inspired by true events, the story of Green Book takes place in 1960s about a gay black pianist, Don Shirley, and his Italian-American driver, Tony Lip, traveling to the Deep South. During their journey, Don Shirley was harassed and received unfair treatment because of his skin color and sexuality. He was denied access to washroom, pulled over, and even attacked in a bar. In his reveal, Burns wrote, "The racist incidents in the film were handled well, highlighting not only the disgusting injustice of the situations, but also the utter nonsense of such a system." Moonlight is based on an unpublished semi-autobiography, which tells the story of a gay black male, Chiron, from his youth to his early adult life. Because of his sexuality, Chiron faced numerous hardships from his classmates. In one scene, he was struck in the face by his lover before being severely beaten by a group of students. Quoting from Ackerman and Puglisi, "The feeling of shame is often deeply embedded within the lie, generating fears that compel him to change his behavior in order to keep from being hurt again." In the film, Chiron's feeling of shame was obviously generated by his sexual orientation. This ultimately led him to believe in the lie: there is no one he could trust, and he coped with it by not being intimate with anyone. According to York, characters are taken on a journey to acknowledge and assimilate their traumas in their past. By confronting and coming to terms with the cause of their traumas, they can finally move on. In the ending scene, Chiron dealt with his past by reuniting with his lover and mother. Hearing his mother's confession and talking to his lover again, Chiron came to terms with his traumas and finally moved on. Like the previous films, 12 Years a Slave is also based on real events. Described by Evans as not a film for the casual viewer, the story is set in 1841 and tells a tragic account of Solomon Northup, a free African American who was kidnapped and sold to the South for slavery for 12 years. In many scenes, we see Northup and other slaves being whipped brutally. Many scenes set the viewer on edge with their uncompromising dedication to a realistic depiction. Rape, whippings, and lynching all force the viewer to face things that Americans would lie to forget about slavery. As we can see, not only do these Oscars Best Picture feature an African American protagonist who encounters discriminations, they also suffer severe physical abuses to a point which their lives were in serious danger. If the extent of violence suffered by the black protagonist is not great, the film is still likely to win an Oscar, just not a big one. BlacKkKlansman and Get Out won Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Original Screenplay respectively, and were nominated for Best Picture in their corresponding years. BlacKkKlansman is a true crime film about an African-American police, Ron Stallworth, who managed to infiltrate the Ku Klux Klan and expose them. Comparing BlacKkKlansman to three Best Pictures I mentioned earlier, the racial discrimination Stallworth received was indirect and relatively less, as he only communicated with the KKK on phone. None of the members were aware that they were speaking to a black person, so even when racial slurs were used, they were not meant for Stallworth. Get Out is a fictional story about an African American named Chris who went to visit his white girlfriend's parents and found out that it was all a setup. They were trying to steal his body. The connection between slavery and Get Out is so overt that I have to call it a modern-day slavery. Although Chris was hypnotized and tied up, he was never whipped or beaten, since his body was seen as an asset by his kidnappers. The story of Get Out feels very real but unreal at the same time. The unreal aspect being the whole surgical thing, while the real aspect being the constant fear that somewhere, someone is going to do harm to you. Despite the film's box office success and critical acclaims, a controversy was sparked when the film was nominated for Best Motion Picture, Musical or Comedy instead of Drama. Clearly, someone thinks the unreal aspect of the film outruns its real aspect. In response to the controversy, director Jordan Peele went on to social media and called it a documentary. Later, he explained, "The reason for the visceral response to this movie being called a comedy is that we are still living in a time in which African American cries for justice aren't being taken seriously. It is important to acknowledge that though there are funny moments, the systemic racism that the movie is about is very real." I would not be going into details of why Get Out is seen as a comedy or musical. However, I would like to point out one thing, and that is the racial elements in the film were not being taken seriously. The pattern in here is simple. If a film features an African American protagonist who faces discrimination but does not get beat up, or the protagonist suffers racial persecutions but the events are portrayed in a dark humor way, it will still likely to win an Oscar, just not a big one. Although Judas and the Black Messiah did not win Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay, Daniel Kaluuya, who played Fred Hampton, took home the trophy for Best Supporting Actor. Fred Hampton was the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. At the age of 21, Hampton was shot to death by the FBI while asleep. Kaluuya's win reinforces my point about black people having to play victims in films in order to win. While it is undeniable that people might associate black people with hardships, because after all, most African Americans living in the United States today are descendants of slaves. Moreover, the amount of gun violence in Hood has proven to be greater than any other areas. However, the Academy's tendency to award films which portray black people as victims reflects their stereotypical opinions about the ethnic group. This corresponds to Alenian's point about the standardized images of poverty, decay, death, and devastation that have, in the American press and imagination, come stand from motherland Africa. I will now move on to talk about Asian films, but before I do that, I would like to bring out the imbalance of Best Picture nominations between films about black people and films about Asians. Over the past decade, 13 films which deal with African Americans were nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. And what is the number for Asian films? 2. That's right, only 2. This made me think of Yao Ming's Hall of Fame induction speech, which lasted about 15 minutes. Allen Iverson and Shaquille O'Neal, whom Yao thanked in his speech, were also inducted in the same year. Both of their speeches were longer than half an hour. Of course, one can attribute Yao's short speech to language barrier, but if we observe the phenomenon in a macro level, it may have something to do with Asian culture's emphasis on collectivism as well as pacifism. In his speech, Yao referred himself as a group person. Yao's preference for the flexi self over the big pit self led to his voice being described as understated and self-effacing, despite the fact that he is an NBA superstar. Even in Yao's 2004 memoir, readers do not get to hear his voice until several pages in. Prior to Yao's first matchup with O'Neal in 2003, O'Neal used racial slurs to mock the then rookie's Chinese ethnicity.
Wang Zhu, whatever your name is, you want some of Shaq food? Come get it. I'll be waiting for you.
But instead of ranting on social media, Yao lets action speaks for itself.
First quarter scoreless, Yao. All Yao early in this one. Houston with a 2-0 lead. Would they be able to hold on? Later in the first quarter, Shaq spinning. Blocked by Yao. Yao blocked O'Neal's first 3 shots of the game.
Perhaps one of the reasons behind the lack of representation of Asians has to do with this self-effacing quality. As mentioned by Moon, Asian actors in the early 20th century Hollywood, Setsu Hayakawa, Anna May Wong, and Philip Ahn, were frustrated by the stereotypical roles given to them. However, very little was done to change the social-political situation of the time. Asian characters in films have always been limited to the yellow pearl, the perpetual foreigner, and the exotic geisha. The yellow pearl stereotype depicts Asian as taking from America without giving anything in return, while the perpetual foreigner stereotype reinforces the minority as racially and culturally different from the American mainstream, thus inassimilable. The creation of these stereotypes came from the fear of Asian immigrants in the 19th and early 20th centuries by white Americans, who perceived people of Asian descent or Oriental as unassimilable foreigners who would eventually overtake the nation and wreak social and economic havoc. However, in the late 20th century, a new stereotype about Asians emerged, the model minority myth. This stereotype is opposite to the ones mentioned earlier, as Asians are viewed as assimilable due to their obedience, intelligence, productivities, and family-centered lifestyles. Although the model minority myth seems to reinforce the positive traits in Asian as well as their cultures, it is nonetheless problematic as it hardly reflects the lived realities of the minority. Moreover, it legitimizes institutional racism in the US by making light of the racial discriminations encountered by Asians. One thing I want to note here, stereotypical depictions are ambivalent because they often feature opposing ideas. Therefore, Asians can be the yellow pearl and model minority at the same time. In the following discussion, I will demonstrate how various stereotypes about Asians are exhibited in Parasite and Minari. Both Parasite and Minari feature a narrative which Lystina and Alpa would call moving on up. Parasite centers on the Kim family who lie their way into working for a wealthy family, the Parks, by pretending to be unrelated and highly qualified personnel. Slopes and stairs were used as visual allegories of the social hierarchy. Although the Kims were cunning and deceitful, they were incredibly intelligent as they managed to fool the Parks completely. Moreover, they were depicted as a harmonious family. The Parks, on the other hand, despite being rich and well-mannered, were oblivious of the things going on inside their house. Mrs. Park was portrayed as a naive and overdramatic mother, while Mr. Park was an arrogant guy who had a sense of superiority within him. As we can see, both the Kims and the Parks are complex individuals who fit into both the yellow pearl and the model minority stereotypes. The housekeeper and her husband were perhaps the only one-dimensional characters in the film. Right from the beginning, the audience were already aware of her eccentricity, from the way she spoke and the way she woke up Mrs. Park. Upon realizing the housekeeper had been hiding her deranged husband in the hidden bunker of the mansion for years, things got even stranger. Minari is somewhat similar to Parasite as it also focuses on a family, the Yees, struggling to make money. However, It is less dramatic and closer to reality. After all, the film is based on director Lee Isaac Chung's childhood. The story takes place in Arkansas during the 80s and centers on a Korean immigrant family. The first model minority stereotype here is the hardworking Asians. Both the parents, Jacob and Monica, were diligent workers at a hatchery. Although Jacob was good at sexing chicks, he had more ambition for his career. He began growing Korean produce and contacting vendors in Dallas. The second model minority stereotype is the family-centered Asian. There is no doubt Jacob and Monica loved their two children, Anne and David, and wanted the best for them. Moreover, Anne was a mature character who looked after her younger brother while the parents were away. Despite the family was running low on cash, they took Sun-ja, aka Monica's mother, in as her health was deteriorating. Initially, David was hostile to her grandmother, but over time, the two began to bond. Towards the end of the film, Monica and Jacob had agreed to divorce, but when the fire broke out in their barn, the two chose to save each other instead of the commodities. The third model minority stereotype is the assimilable Asians. The Yees were able to fit into the community. They attended church where David met a new friend and had stayed over at his house. They also befriended Paul despite his awkwardness and eccentricity. Let's now focus on the yellow pearl stereotypes found in Minari. Jacob farmed on the land which he did not purchase. Instead of buying county water, he dug up holes on the ground and stole underground water. His action is exactly what Pollard referred to as taking from America without giving anything in return. At one point, he got too obsessed with making money that he almost left the family. So we can see, both Parasite and Minari depict their Asian characters as yellow pearl and the model minority. According to Rabinow, representations are social facts. They do not simply reflect existent, given realities, but are active participants in the construction and understanding of such realities and the very category of reality itself. However, it is unfair to only reward films which feature African Americans as subject of persecution, or Asians as the yellow pearl and model minority. It is sad to realize what Dreyfus, Rabinow, and Foucault said was true, that the struggle against subjection and forms of subjectivity are the major phenomenon of films in this century. As Olinian pointed out, the context and constituent force of representations remains the last source of defense against the subjugated group's social content. If the Academy continue to only reward films which offer such limited representation to ethnic minorities, that last of defense against racial stereotype is going to collapse soon, leaving only a one-sided image for Black people and Asians.